Francis Wells, ha studiato medicina e cardiochirurgia a Cambridge, poi sta negli Stati Uniti, Birmingham, Alabama per 30 anni, poi torna a Cambridge e diventa allievo di un grandissimo chirurgo. By the way, è il primo al mondo a impiantare questo device di sostituzione della funzione del cuore. E lui si è sempre interessato di arte e di musica, suonava il piano, e mi sembra che dica che non si ricorda bene, ma forse era bravo, e io sono sicuro che è vero, probabilmente era modesta questa. E poi nella sua formazione c'è il Rinascimento. Ha studiato a fondo i magnifici documenti di Leonardo, grazie anche alla generosità della Royal Library a Windsor. E poi crea la coreografia di un balletto, Siobhan Davis Ballet Company di Londra, una nuova danza che, manco a dirlo, è ispirata alla struttura della fisiologia del cuore di Leonardo. Allestisce la mostra sui disegni di Leonardo a Windsor Great Library, pensate, una cosa probabilmente indimenticabile, e fa un libro dove la prefazione è scritta dal principe Charles ed è molto carina, e questo libro è Interpreting Leonardo nella sostanza After Modern Cardiac Physiology, ed è esattamente quello di cui lui ci parla oggi.
Grazie, Professore Direttore. It's a great honor to be invited. I'm sorry for the lack of Italian, but I will try to go reasonably slowly. The title is The Heart of Leonardo, Cardiac Anatomy and Physiology, as witnessed by me through contemporary eyes. I couldn't begin, however, without being in this great city making reference to, how does this go forwards? To Leonardo's trip to Rome, where he reports in his notes that he must pack his blue spectacles. What else could he take to this center of haute couture in the Western world? So, beginning with a quote from Isaac Newton, "If I've seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." And I would like you just to reflect for the moment on whose shoulders did Leonardo stand. If you're thinking about the cardiac anatomy, which we're going to spend our time talking about, there is very little. I wrote a paper recently. I made the point that there was absolutely no use for cardiac anatomy and Leonardo's understanding of it in his time, because there was no cardiac surgery, there was no cardiac physiology, there was no medicine or no understanding of disease. Interestingly, the reviewer rejected that standing, but I stand by what I said, that there was of no use to anybody at that time. It's interesting, if you look at the notebooks of Alberti, you see a similar layout to some of Leonardo's notebooks. And when you read Leonardo's earlier notes on Galen, on his anatomy, Galen comes up in time and time again. Roughly about 100 years before Leonardo, this was a drawing from the Bodleian in Oxford, and I would defy anybody to try and do cardiac surgery on the basis of this. But we move further forwards by about 80 years to the drawing you've already seen from Domenico, and probably an illustration for bloodletting, about 1480-82. It's very early in Leonardo's anatomical life, and again remains quite Galenic, with the liver as the seat of the circulation, which Leonardo referred to as the dung heap of the body. Another 10 years, 15 years later, we see he's progressed to this, and I particularly show this diagram, often known affectionately by those of us who study his work as the Great Lady, because it illustrates what you have to be very careful of in looking at Leonardo's drawings. It's an amalgam of animal, human, fetal, adult, male, and female anatomy. It's basically a state of knowledge, I think, of his knowledge at that time. It's also a drawing that's been pricked for transfer, so clearly the idea was the transference of knowledge to others. I want to rush forward a few hundred years, and the drawings were lost for, well, I use the word advisedly, lost for a long period of time, and then rediscovered by Richard Dalton, who was the King's librarian, King George III. And the first person that Dalton showed them to was William Hunter, the foremost anatomist of his time. And I just draw your eyes to Hunter's words. when I consider which pains he's taken on every part of the body, the superiority of his universal genius, his particular excellence in mechanics, hydraulics, the attention with which such a man would examine and see objects which he was to draw, I am fully persuaded that Leonardo was the best anatomist at that time in the world. Very powerful words from a man who was a powerful anatomist himself, who also went on to describe William Harvey's work as nothing more than someone could have done of average intelligence with a few hours' work. So what framed Leonardo's way of thinking? Well, he was an illegitimate son of a notary. He had a non-classical education. Perhaps the lax family environment in Vinci, being brought up by his grandfather and his uncle, engendered a broad perspective. He grew up in natural surroundings. He enjoyed a musical and artistic childhood. And he was, by all accounts, a flamboyant dresser. And he seemed to enjoy company. It was very popular. His words here, which I repeat, if indeed I have no power to quote from authors as they have, it's a far bigger and more worthy thing to read by the light of experience. And you see this time and time again in his notes, where he's railing against perhaps his critics, other academics, and claiming his own ground to think for himself, which is something that is commendable to all students today. So this is a little passage I found in Gombrich's Art and Illusion. And he said, what prompted me to take up the study of these astonishing drawings was the relationship between seeing and knowing, or thought and perception. There could be no more important witness for the student of this problem than Leonardo. The correct interpretation of nature rests upon the intellectual understanding as much as upon good eyesight. And I think in the heart studies you see this par excellence in Leonardo's work. But you can see all sorts of things when you look around. You all know this, the Munch exhibition, which is about to start in London, the very well-known drawing, The Scream. And I was looking at a cardiac MRI the other day and found the scream in the heart. So you have to be careful how you interpret these things from time to time. The philosophy that Domenico has already referred to, you find very much in Leonardo's notes. And I know that Martin Kemp likes to think of Leonardo as much more of a natural philosopher than an anatomist. And you see it very much in his analogy of the seed to the heart, where Galen argued the liver was the seat of the circulation, but Leonardo argued it was the heart. And just as the roots grow down from the seed and the branches grow up, so the arteries grow out of the heart and the veins return to it. A beautiful piece of lateral thinking. There's very little reference to when all the anatomy was exactly completed. The two dates that we have are the two listed here. But I think you'll find most of the heart anatomy was done at his time when he was in Vappio d'Arda, having escaped from Milan, and then early on in Rome. It's worthwhile reminding ourselves of what it was like to dissect at that time and the diligence with which Leonardo pursued it. He said, in order to obtain an exact and complete knowledge, I've dissected more than 10 human bodies. And he goes on to describe the detail with which he dissects. And anybody who's done dissection in a dissecting room knows how difficult this is. And he says he repeated it twice over, perhaps more, to discover the differences. And you've already heard about his comparative anatomy between animals and humans, the young and the old. Now, the heart. What are Leonardo's of the heart? Well, he says, admirable instrument invented by the supreme master. Wonderful, flowery language. But he goes on rapidly to say, with what words will you describe this heart so as not to fill a book? The longer you write on the details, the more you will confuse the mind of the auditor. And you heard Domenico referring to the visual bias of Leonardo over the written word. You will also be in need of commentators, or be required to return to experience, experiment, which in your case is very brief, and gives knowledge of but few things concerning the whole subject of which you desire an entire knowledge. What is interesting is that as the cardiac studies go on, the actual drawing gets less and the writing gets more as he moves swiftly from form to function. These words I like very much. He said, the heart in itself is not the beginning of life. We know it doesn't start to beat until 6 weeks of intrauterine life. Of course, he didn't know that. But it is a vessel made of muscle, vivified and nourished by the artery and vein, as are other muscles. In other words, don't get too excited. It's a lump of muscle like the rest of them. Instead of the heart, this moves of itself. This is automaticity from the sinus node, and does not stop unless forever. If it stops, you're done for. Marvelous instrument invented by the Supreme Master. Now, Leonardo's work is sandwiched between these two illustrations. You see the illustration by Berengario de Carpi of the heart, and Vesalius and De Fabrica. And lying between these two is this. And the great sadness was it was never published. This is the most wonderful page that illustrates all sorts of things. First of all, planes of dissection, the true anatomy of the ox heart, which I'm going to talk you through in some detail, the coronary arteries, the opening and closing of the aortopulmonary valves, and this beautiful schematic diagram, which has been overlooked for a long time, which actually reflects what we now call the atrioventricular loop. It's the relationship between the leaflets, the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles, and the left ventricular free wall. If you cut out the mitral valve and you do nothing to reconnect the ventricular wall to the base of the heart, these patients, 60% are dead in 5 years through heart failure. Now, you've heard about his dissection of the old man in Santa Maria Nuova, so I'm not going to dwell on this, except to say this is a wonderful piece of observation carried out in the post-mortem room. I also want to point out that he says, death found to proceed from debility through lack of blood and deficiency of the artery, which nourishes the heart and the lower members. I think it's very worthwhile pointing out to people that he's talking about disseminated atherosclerosis, not just cardiac atherosclerosis, which it's easy to think of. And he goes on to describe this, the thickening of the vessels, which Domenico has already described, thank you, so we won't go through again. But see the little health warning on the bottom? This occurs through lack of exercise since the blood is not warm. So I hope you'll all go out and have a run tonight after the lecture. And you've already seen this, so again, it gives me more time to talk about what I want to talk about. But I just want to mention to you this astute observation that the narrowings occur in the proximal vessels. And in the coronary arteries, in coronary artery disease, this is where we find primary atherosclerosis at the division of the major vessels, less so in the peripheral vessels, which we see in other disease states. Now, returning to my initial comments between Galen and Leonardo, this is taken from the Great Lady, and you can see here the heart is illustrated as a two-chambered structure. And it was Leonardo who first described the heart as a four-chambered structure. This is taken from Paris Manuscript G in the Great Library of France, and this is a beautiful, simple illustration of atrial contraction, ventricular relaxation, and ventricular contraction and atrial relaxation. This is the first demonstration of the synchronicity of the ventricular atrial contraction and the fact that the heart is a four-chambered structure. And I just put alongside it a modern diagram of the heart schematically shown, and you see how wonderful his representation of this is, even in his schematic diagram. A lot of the work, as you've heard, was done in the Santa Maria Concezione, but also I think some probably was done in Santo Spirito in the walls of the Vatican, very close by, and I just put it here because it's such a beautiful part of this wonderful city. So on to the main subject of the talk. This is what Leonardo had to start with. That's all he had, an ox, block, heart and lung. And from this he produced the most amazing system of drawings. Here we are repeating all of Leonardo's dissections of the heart and lungs. And for those of you who have never done dissection, which of course he was never trained in dissection as we are, he had no textbook of anatomy, he had no experts of anatomy to teach him, he came up with these amazing observations. Now, this is taken from McAlpine's book, one of the most wonderful books on cardiac anatomy. And the very first thing that McAlpine does is describe how he revealed the structures of the heart, his method of fixation, the way he illustrated it, and the fact that he struggled with this for many years. And look at Leonardo's comments. If you look in the diagrams, he shows you how he sections the heart and how he fixed the heart. A beautiful way. I've reproduced this, and it actually works. Pouring hot wax into the ascending of the aorta, waiting for it to set, and then dissecting it out, and you see the heart in its fixed state. So at every pitch and turn, you have to take great credence of his notes. Here are his planes of section of the heart. Sorry, if I just go back. And here is a modern-day diagram of for cardiac pathologies, how to make these planes of section. The heart is a complex cone. That's a geometric definition, a cone with a twist. And therefore, actually sectioning it accurately is not as easy as you might think. Now, here is this wonderful page I showed you before, and here is an ox heart. And you can see straight away the accuracy of this diagram of the ox heart. Initially, when people commented on these, many people said, well, it can't be very accurate because it doesn't look like a human heart. Well, it's not. It's an ox heart, and there is a real ox heart. He did wonderful dissections of the main coronary arteries, the left main coronary artery, the left anterior ascending, the diagonal branch, and the circumflex. And here we are doing the same planes of dissection. And again, you can see the absolute accuracy of these illustrations. And here is from McAlpine's textbook, and you can see again, very, very superimposable on Leonardo's drawings. So Leonardo's drawings, this type of drawing of the heart, are dissection notes. And here is an example of the circumflex coronary artery lying underneath the left atrial appendage, and here it is in life. You get a sort of sense of electricity down your spine when you're doing this, as though Leonardo's in the room with you. It is so accurate. It is so reproducible. And if you look again at the display of the coronary arteries here, like the coronet around the base of the heart, here you can see a modern-day illustration of the same thing. So you have to take Leonardo's drawing seriously, even in modern times. It relates you to exactly what he saw. The arrangement of the coronary arteries around the apex of the heart is particularly accurate. The transection of the left ventricle, which you see here, so through this plane of the heart, he made these sections. You can see here is the left ventricular muscle, and I'm going to come on to these little structures in a moment. The right ventricle, and you see the crenations of the right ventricular septal wall, which are what expand to allow the heart to put more volume through it. The right ventricle responds to volume overload, the left ventricle to pressure overload. And here you can see the same dissection as Leonardo's. And you see the gross papillary muscles, which you see in the ox heart. Now, these structures here, sorry, just to go back, have relatively recently been described. They're part of the conduction system of the right atrioventricular bundle. Don't worry about that. It's just to show you they're very important parts of the conduction system of the heart. When I first looked at this drawing of Leonardo's, I thought, well, maybe these are chordae tendini, but they don't go from the papillary muscle to the septum. It's not like this. And in fact, when I cut the section, that's exactly what we saw. But what we were seeing with these so-called false tendons, branches of the left bundle of the AV conduction system, and they're interestingly also, because of Leonardo's interest in music, they're known as the substrate of musical murmurs. You get flow murmurs through the heart, and the flow of blood over these can cause musical murmurs. Now, you've all done a potato prints as a child. Cut a potato, carve something on the base of it, dip it in some ink, and put it on some paper. Well, this is a potato print of a transection of the left ventricle with the blood in the ventricle, and you can see it almost directly is superimposable on Leonardo's diagrams. So extremely accurate diagrams. If you look at the mitral valve, the underside, the primary and secondary tertiary chordae, again, you see this wonderful reproduction of anatomy. And here it is in the actual ox heart being opened out, and you can see how accurate Leonardo's representation of this was. And this is what he would have seen. This is exactly what he would have been observing. Now, this drawing is quite extraordinary. This is the top right-hand page, and I was talking to Professor Gulizzi before we started, and apparently they found all the plates from the Quaderni, which was published in 1910. And they were taken, of course, when the illustrations have seen very little light of day. This is quite faded in the drawings now, and it's actually not really been commented on before, but this is the underside of the mitral valve. And this is the tertiary cord of the mitral valve. This is the strut cord, which remains tensioned throughout the cardiac cycle. And here it is in dissection, and it's extraordinary. Even the section of plane of the secondary cords are exactly as Leonardo reproduced it. So another amazing observational piece of anatomy. And this little drawing here, I mentioned already, which is the pulley, weights and pulleys of the diagram of the interaction between the mitral valve and the left ventricle. Now, I spend my life reconstructing mitral valves, and to get a good functioning mitral valve, you need what we call coaptation. Heart valves don't close like the leaf of a door, which is where the word valve comes from, the leaflet of a door, but they close in coaptation like this. So when we're repairing the valve, it's very important to restore that. So why is Leonardo measuring the height of coaptation? Was he trying to tell me something about the way I should repair a valve? And when he measures the height, it's exactly the same that we say, about a centimetre in height. Most, if not all, of the drawings are ox drawings. But this drawing on cream paper, almost certainly for Rome, is human. This is the human right ventricle, and here is an actual human right ventricle opened up in the same plane of section. Papillary muscle, chordae, chordae, leaflet, septal leaflet, and the same here. And you can see how accurate this representation is. And with his skill at draftsmanship, to be able to render the feeling of depth into this ventricle is extraordinary with his few strokes of the pen and brown ink. Now, I mentioned to you how he fixed the heart, injecting hot wax into it. And this beautiful drawing of the underside of the tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve, with a moderator band, is a beautiful demonstration of this. And again, he did the same thing. So we did the same thing. We injected hot wax into the heart. We waited for the heart to set with rigor mortis and then cut it out. And you see exactly the same view that Leonardo had. He then describes drawing the leaflets and cutting them out to demonstrate how the valve works as a teaching aid. So here we've cut the valve out. You can see the moderator band divided here. Leaflet, leaflet, cords, cords, papillary muscles. Extraordinary accurate rendition. So turning now to function of the valve, you may or may not know that this area of the outlet of the heart, in my opinion, is erroneously called the sinus of Valsalva. The only contribution that Valsalva made to this is in this Tractus on the Ear by Morgani, where there is this illustration with no commentary whatsoever. If we look at Leonardo's work, and he said experimentation is so important, before you base a law in this case, test it 2 or 3 times and see whether the test produces the same effect. And he went on to do a wonderful experiment on the aortic valve, the aortopulmonary valve. And this was done probably when he was in Vapriodada, when he was doing a lot of work on the flow of water in the Codex Leicester. This is Meltz's family villa in Vapriodada, and this beautiful drawing of the chain ferry across the river there. And this is another piece of work he did at a similar time, perhaps a bit before, showing the effect of flowing water through these narrowing openings where they were eroding the bank of the river. And if we now then turn to his drawings of the aortic valve, he uses this knowledge of vorticile formation to actually understand how the valve closes. And if this was a room full of cardiologists, and I asked everyone in this room how the aortic valve closes, 95% would say it closes by the reflux of the blood on the valve leaflets. But it doesn't work like that, and it couldn't work like that, and he understood that. He worked out that actually the blood flowing from a large opening to another large opening through a small orifice always forms vortices. He noted that the aortopulmonary junction was smaller than the actual orifice of the valve, which it is by 10%, and he noticed that the blood hitting the underside of the sinus would turn back on itself and form these vortices. And there's this beautiful page after page of drawing and exploration of this idea. And here you can see a drawing, a modern drawing of the outlet of the heart, and an illustration from a modern textbook of anatomy showing this arrangement with the sinuses of Valsalva. He also then applied some lateral thinking from hydrodynamic engineering using fluid drag and nonlinear flow in a water pipe to explain how these vortices might also form. And he said that when the heart contracts, blood from the lower ventricle rushes with impetus through the cusps, then forms a vortex that grows against the walls of the sinus and the valve leaflet. So what he's saying is the blood rushes through, forms the vortex, runs down the wall of the sinus, and unfolds the leaflets. And then the regurgitation of the blood does the rest of the work. And he describes at great length how this works. And it's beautifully written. There's the other thing you find when you start to read Leonardo's notes. Not only was he a beautiful artist, but he wrote beautifully. He was very succinct in his use of words, and it's well worth reading and studying very carefully. And he went on, and then what he does so beautifully, he argues against himself. He says, what happens if my argument is not true? And from that, he says, if I'm not right, then maybe the reflux of the blood would just fold up the leaflets and it wouldn't work. And that's exactly what we see in giving cardioplegia during cardiac surgery. He then went on to describe an experimental model, and he said, make this test in a glass model and move inside it water and panic grass seeds. And here he's drawing the cast of the left ventricular outflow tract, which he cast in glass, then built a circulation model of water in it and pumped in grass seeds. Now, I had this discussion with Professor Martin Kemp. He said, well, the grass seeds are too large. It couldn't have worked. There are actually 5,500 species of grass seed in Italy alone. And some of them, particularly in the Milanese region, are extremely small. So it is quite possible that he did this experiment that he described. He also went on and designed a semilunar valve, which he would then place in the aortic root. So this is the first synthetic valve, which looks very much like the mosaic valve we use today. And here are some wonderful laminar flow diagrams of the vortices forming, and an illustration thereof against Leonardo's drawings. Now, you may well know that during the period in Milan, he was, and later in Rome, living in the Belvedere with Pacioli, a mathematician. And these are some of the geometric solids, which we don't have time to discuss today, that Leonardo drew for the De Divino Proportioni, which Pacioli published. Leonardo said, "He who does not know the supreme certainty of mathematics is wallowing in confusion. No human investigation can be called true science, which has not passed through the mathematical demonstrations." And I know that the editor of The Lancet would love that. Nothing can be proved without statistics. So, in 1968, two brothers, Bellhouse and Bellhouse in Oxford, set about trying to demonstrate whether Leonardo was right or not. They designed a system rather like Leonardo had done, and they demonstrated that Leonardo's hypothesis was correct. It's the only paper I've ever seen in The Lancet with only one reference, and the reference is 500 years old. And here you can see the mathematical proof, which extends for 6 pages, which Leonardo, I'm sure, would have loved. We didn't stop there, however. This is a heart that we then went on with some very intricate software and extracted all the substance of the heart, show the flow of blood through the heart. And if you fix your eyes here and here, you can see transiently in early systole, do you see them? The formation of the vortices that Leonardo described. Now, we thought this was rather interesting, so we looked at the rest of the heart, and we found vortices all over the place. And one of the interesting things is as the heart fails in heart failure, the vortices break down. And as anatomists and surgeons, it's very easy to think of the heart as an empty structure, either on a bench in the anatomy department or collapsed during heart surgery with the blood exhausted. But of course it is not. Blood has mass, and the mass of blood interacts with the left ventricular wall. And this observation has now led to some interesting research that I'm doing with Imperial College on the impact of this vorticil flow in the normal heart. But he didn't stop there. He went on to talk about the elasticity of the aortic root. And he said the valve cannot function if the aortic root is not elastic, because the leaflets will tear away from the side of the aorta. And this is the whole basis of what we now call stentless valve technology. So these thoughts are absolutely apposite in the modern world. But he didn't stop there. He then went on to argue why the valve is tricuspid, not quadricuspid or bicuspid. And he did it with a beautiful geometric proof. And you can actually work it out for yourselves. In the tricuspid valve, the height from the base to the apex is lower than a quadricuspid valve. And in a bileaflet valve, it can't open at all easily because the hinge mechanism is poor. And this, by the way, is the first ever representation of a bicuspid aortic valve. Now, one of the hot topics in cardiology at the moment is cardiac twist. No heart muscle cell can contract for more than 20% of its length. So how, if the fire bell goes off and you all get up to rush out of the room, how do you put your cardiac output up to 80 or 90%? Well, you do it by the effect of like wringing out of a towel. If you imagine you've got out of the swimming pool, you've dried yourself off, the towel's wet, you wring it out. And the heart wrings itself out. Now, Leonardo was sitting on the Tuscan hillside enjoying a barbecue one evening, which he mentions in his notes, and they were killing pigs with spikes, or spirals as he called them, being plunged into the chest. And he noticed different moments of rotation of the spiral, depending where the spike went into the heart. And he starts to begin to actually speculate on the movement of the heart, a point of equipoise, and the different points of rotation above and below the point of equipoise. And again, didn't go any further, it didn't mean much to him, but here he is observing profound, primary, modern, cutting-edge physiology of the heart. This whole idea of cardiac twist has been taken forwards by a chap called Torrent Gasp and Professor Buckberg, who recently sadly died, who transposed this into this argument, which actually both of them in this always look to the giants before you. This was done by a chap called Richard Lauer, a country physician in 1664 in England. But again, it just amplifies the importance of knowing the status of knowledge before you start. I'm coming to a close quickly, but I cannot finish without mentioning the bronchial circulation. In lung transplantation, the biggest problem is airway dehiscence. The trachea or the bronchi break down. And that's because the lung has a dual circulation, the bronchial circulation and the pulmonary arterial circulation. Now, why on earth would Leonardo be looking so carefully to find these? And then he describes the importance of both. He gets it a little bit wrong in that he says that the movements of the lung inside the chest would dislocate the pulmonary arterial, so they have these finer branches. But he does say that these perfuse the upper airways. So we then set about trying to find these, and it's a very difficult dissection. You can just see them here in the ox, heart and lungs. And here is a photograph of this dissection. Here is the trachea, here is the arch of the aorta, and there is the bronchial artery. And there is Leonardo's beautiful dissection. And here is a modern-day magnetic resonance image showing the same thing. So again, if you just sit for a moment and ponder on the mind of this man and the detail that he was prepared to work through with the material that he had, with no help, no support, and the conclusions that he came to in the modern time, you realize this was absolute genius of any age. So, I haven't got time to tell you much more, but these are some of Leonardo's discoveries, any one of which would have given him a PhD in Imperial College or even the Accademia Lincei, I think. Bronchial arteries, the moderator band, the sinus of Valsalva, aortic valve closure. He demonstrated the heart as a four-chambered organ, the atria contracting separately from the ventricles, cardiac twist, and he was the first to describe the first congenital defect, atrial defect. And adding to Domenico's comments on the doctors, Leonardo said, "Endeavour to preserve thy health in which thou succeed the better, the more thou guardest thyself from the physicians. For their mixtures are a kind of alchemy in which there are no fewer books than there are remedies." And I, on that note, would like to end. Thank you very much.